I smelled the smoke a full 20 minutes before I saw it. An acrid green-brown scent riding low on a wind that had shifted overnight from its usual westerly drift. And by the time I understood what that particular color of brown climbing the northern sky actually meant, I had already started making the kind of calculations no daughter should have to make alone. How many hours until it reached the house? How many head of cattle I could realistically move in that time? And which of the two things my father had spent 30 years building, I would have to choose to save first, if it came to that. The morning itself had started ordinary enough. Chores half finished and coffee still warm on the stove. Before that smell changed everything a person could reasonably expect from the day ahead. My father had suffered his stroke that spring, 6 months before the fire. A seizing in his chest one morning while checking the north fence line that had left the whole right side of him weakened past any real usefulness. Though his mind remained sharp enough that I sometimes thought the particular cruelty of his condition was watching a body fail, while the will inside it stayed every bit as stubborn as it had always been. I had found him myself that morning, collapsed against a fence post with the particular gray stillness that told me before I'd even reached him that whatever had happened was serious. And I had ridden the 4 miles to town for the doctor faster than I had ever ridden anything in my life, praying the whole way in the same wordless fashion a person prays when there isn't time for proper sentences. He sat most days now on the porch in a chair I'd built him myself out of ranch lumber, watching the work he could no longer do with an expression I had learned to read as love rather than judgment, though some mornings, running the ranch's daily arithmetic alone in his place, I still felt the old fear that I was managing it all considerably worse than he would have, and that the ranch itself somehow knew the difference. The fire had started, as far as anyone later pieced together, from a dry lightning strike 10 miles north 2 days before any rain followed it, catching in grass gone brittle after the driest August the county had seen in a decade, cured to a pale gold that crackled underfoot and burned, once lit, with a speed that surprised even ranchers who'd fought range fires most of their working lives. It had spent that first day and night working through country too sparsely settled for anyone to raise the alarm before it had already grown considerably larger than any single ranch could hope to fight alone, feeding on mile after mile of exactly the kind of tall, dry grass that made that stretch of country good cattle range in wetter years and a tinderbox in a season like this one. Word reached our place by a rider from the Hendricks spread at first light. A boy of perhaps 14, pushing his horse harder than any horse should be pushed on such dry ground, shouting the news before he'd even fully reined up in our yard. And I remember standing in my own kitchen doorway watching that column of smoke thicken against the horizon, and understanding, with a clarity that frightened me considerably more than the fire itself, that I had perhaps 6 hours before it reached us, and no husband, no grown brother, no father capable of riding a horse to help me meet it. It was Wyatt Calloway who rode in less than an hour after that boy's warning, before I had even finished hitching the plow team myself. And I want to tell you plainly that his arrival surprised me more than the fire did, because the Calloway spread bordered ours along a fence line that had marked more than a decade of careful, chilly politeness between our two families rather than anything resembling neighborly warmth. Our fathers had fallen out badly years before over a grazing lease. Both families believed the county had promised them exclusively, a dispute that had never gone to court but had cost both men considerable money in lawyers' letters and considerably more pride in the telling and retelling around town. I remembered, as a girl of perhaps 10, watching my own father come home from a county meeting on that particular dispute, white-faced with anger, refusing to speak old man Calloway's name at our own supper table for the better part of a year afterward, and I had grown up understanding, the way children understand such things without ever being told directly, that a Calloway was a person our family regarded with courtesy but never warmth, a rule I had followed without much question for the better part of 2 decades. The particular result of that old quarrel was that Wyatt and I had spent a decade nodding politely at church and saying almost nothing else to each other, beyond what basic courtesy required of neighbors who could not quite bring themselves to be friends. He came anyway that morning, without being asked and without any apparent hesitation about whether an old family quarrel had any business mattering on a day like this one. He was already dismounting by the time I reached the yard, sun-darkened and dark-haired beneath a hat gone gray with dust, already surveying our north pasture with the particular calculating stillness of a man doing the same arithmetic I'd been doing since I first smelled smoke. "Fire doesn't care whose name is on which fence post," he said by way of greeting. "And I'll be damned if I let a grazing lease neither of our fathers even remembers the particulars of anymore cost you your herd today." I asked him, half out of genuine curiosity and half out of the old habit of chilly courtesy. Neither of us had quite shaken yet, whether his own place needed him more urgently than ours did. He shook his head once, plain. "Our north section's mostly rock and thin grass. Won't feed a fire near as hungry as your bottomland will. I can spare the morning here and still make it back before anything of mine's in real danger." I did not have a ready answer for that. I only nodded, grateful past any pride I might otherwise have spent arguing the point, and we started plowing the firebreak together within the hour, working our two teams in a wide arc along the pasture's most vulnerable edge, turning fresh, dark earth in a line meant to starve the coming flames of anything left to burn. Daniel Calloway, no relation to Wyatt beyond the coincidence of a common surname that had confused half the county at some point or another, had been appointed the district's volunteer fire warden that same spring, a position that carried considerable authority during exactly this kind of emergency and correspondingly little glory the rest of the year, mostly involving inspections of plowed firebreaks around homesteads and organizing bucket brigades for the smaller grass fires that flared up most dry summers without ever growing dangerous. The position paid almost nothing, a modest stipend the county commissioners begrudged renewing most years. And Daniel had taken it on, he told me once, mostly because nobody else in the district seemed willing to shoulder the responsibility of a job that earned a man blame considerably more readily than thanks. He rode a wide circuit that morning coordinating what limited resources the county actually possessed. A single hired backfire crew of 6 men experienced, enough to set and control a deliberate burn without losing control of it themselves, 3 water wagons, and whatever volunteer hands could be spared from ranches not yet directly threatened. He reached our place around midday, his horse lathered from the ride, and told us plainly what none of us wanted to hear, that the fire had split into 2 fronts sometime overnight, one bearing down on the Hendricks spread and our own shared boundary, the other curving wider toward the small township itself, and that his single backfire crew could not reach both fronts before dark. We worked that firebreak through the better part of the morning, with barely a wasted word between us. The particular language of shared hard labor, standing in for whatever conversation a decade of chilly distance hadn't prepared us to make easily. The plow blades cut deep into dry sod, turning up earth that smelled of dust and old grass roots. And I remember the specific ache settling into my shoulders by the second hour. The kind of ache that comes from work a person does at the very edge of their own strength, because the alternative is unthinkable. Wyatt drove his team with an economy of motion that told me plainly he'd broken this particular ground before, somewhere on his own place if nowhere else, and once, catching my eye across the widening strip of turned earth between us, he called out that we'd need to widen the break considerably past what either of our fathers would have called sufficient, given how dry the grass had gone this particular August, and I found myself trusting his judgment on the matter without the reflexive suspicion I might once have brought to anything a Calloway suggested. I want to tell you honestly that I understood hearing that, exactly what kind of choice Daniel was actually facing, because a township held perhaps 40 families and every business the county depended on, while our stretch of range held 2 ranches and the cattle on them, and I understood too that no fair-minded accounting of lives and property could reasonably favor 2 ranches over an entire town. I told him as much myself, plainly, expecting him to ride on toward the township with whatever crew he could spare us instead. And he studied me a long moment with an expression I hadn't expected from a man everyone in the county considered thoroughly practical almost to a fault. "The township's got a river on its east side and considerably more hands to fight with when the fire actually reaches it," he said. "You two have got a plowed line half finished and 8 hours less daylight than you need to finish it properly alone. I'll send the crew here first, and I'll answer for that decision to the county commissioners myself. If the township takes damage it wouldn't have taken otherwise." I asked him why, when the arithmetic so plainly favored the larger settlement. Because 40 families with a river and each other stand a fighting chance without my crew, he said. Two ranchers with a stroke-ridden father and a fence-line quarrel between them don't have anything close to that same margin. A warden's job is protecting whoever's actually going to lose everything today, not whoever makes the tidier report afterward. The backfire crew reached us within the hour. 6 weathered men who worked with the particular economy of people who had done this exact grim arithmetic more times than they cared to count, setting a controlled burn along the outer edge of our plowed line that would, if the wind held steady, consume the remaining fuel between our break and the main fire before the two blazes ever properly met. Their foreman, a lean, older man named Prairie, who Daniel introduced only briefly before riding on to check the other front, walked our plowed line twice before committing to where exactly he'd set his own fire, muttering calculations about wind and grass density under his breath, the way another man might recite a familiar prayer. And I understood, watching him work, that this particular craft of fighting fire with fire was itself a skill few men in the county actually possessed. Dangerous enough in careless hands to double a disaster rather than contain it. Wyatt worked alongside them with a competence that told me plainly he'd fought range fires before, directing water wagon placement and beating down stray embers with a wet gunny sack he'd soaked from our own well without needing to be told where the well stood. And I found myself in the particular strange intimacy of shared danger, watching him work with an attention that had considerably less to do with fire management and everything to do with a decade of careful distance suddenly collapsing into something I hadn't let myself examine too closely before that day. My father insisted on being carried out to the porch to watch. Despite my protests that the smoke alone might do his weakened lungs no good, and I understood, arguing with him about it, that some part of what drove him wasn't stubbornness, so much as the particular grief of a man who had spent his whole life meeting exactly this kind of danger himself and could no longer do anything now but witness someone else meeting it in his place. The wind held steady enough through the early afternoon that I let myself believe, briefly, that the worst of the danger might pass us without real incident, a hope that lasted only until the sky itself seemed to shift color overhead, the particular sickly yellow-orange that ranchers in that country learned to read as a warning long before any other sign confirmed it. He called out once, hoarse and urgent, when the wind shifted harder than any of us had accounted for, driving a spray of embers clean across our half-finished break toward the barn. Small burning fragments of grass and ash carried a considerably longer distance than any of us had judged possible only minutes before, and it was Wyatt who reached that spray first, beating it out with his own coat before it caught proper hold, close enough to the flame that I watched him singe his sleeve and did not so much as flinch at the cost. I remember screaming his name across that distance without entirely deciding to. The particular pure terror of watching someone risk themselves for ground that wasn't even his own, and the specific relief afterward when he straightened up, coat smoking slightly but himself entirely unharmed, was unlike anything I had felt in all the months since my father's stroke first taught me how quickly a person's whole world could shift. Sideways without warning, the wind held against us for the better. Part of 2 difficult hours that afternoon, gusting hard enough twice to threaten jumping our entire line before the backfire crew's careful burning had fully consumed the fuel it needed to consume. And I want to be honest that I have rarely in my life felt fear the particular way I felt it watching that orange line advance across ground I had walked every day of my adult life. Land my father had broken with his own hands before I was even born. Understanding all at once how thin the difference actually was between a ranch that survived a day like this one and a ranch that simply stopped existing by evening. I found myself praying during those 2 hours in a way I hadn't prayed since the morning I found my father collapsed against that fence post, wordless and constant. My hands busy enough with water buckets and wet sacking that the praying happened somewhere underneath the work itself rather than in any moment I could have paused to name as prayer. Prairie crew called out constant adjustments to each other across the widening burn, voices raw with smoke. And twice, I watched grown men who'd clearly done this work for years exchange a look of genuine alarm before steadying themselves back into the particular grim focus the job demanded, which frightened me considerably more than any single flame had managed on its own. It was Wyatt who first noticed the cattle beginning to panic in the west pasture. Driven half-mad by smoke and heat, into the particular directionless stampede that killed more stock in a range fire than the flames themselves usually managed. Animals that had grazed peacefully together their whole lives suddenly transformed into a bawling, wild-eyed mass with no more sense between them than a spooked jackrabbit. He did not wait for anyone's permission before swinging back into his saddle and riding straight into that panicked herd, shouting and driving them hard and relentless. Toward the stretch of already blackened ground, our own morning's plowing and burning had cleared. Ground that could not burn twice and offered, however bleak it looked, the only real safety available to frightened animals in that country. I rode after him without entirely deciding to, driving strays from the herd's ragged edges. My own horse skittish and wild-eyed nearly as badly as the cattle themselves. Smoke stinging my eyes raw enough that I lost sight of Wyatt twice in the thick of it, and both times found my heart in my throat until I caught his shape again through the haze. We spent the better part of an hour in that particular controlled chaos, shouting ourselves hoarse, our horses lathered white with effort, before the last of the herd finally settled, exhausted and trembling on the safe black ground behind our line, and I remember sitting my own horse afterward, hands shaking too badly to properly hold the reins, understanding only slowly that we had actually managed it, that the herd my father had spent 30 years building had survived a danger that had come within a single wind shift of taking it all at once. Daniel rode the full circuit twice more that afternoon, checking both fronts personally rather than trusting second-hand reports, a level of diligence I later learned had cost him considerable criticism from commissioners who thought a warden's job was better spent coordinating from a fixed post than riding himself ragged across half the county. It was on his second pass through our place, well past what should have been supper time, his own horse nearly as spent as ours, that he told us the township's own volunteer bucket brigades had managed, with considerably more effort than anyone had expected from townsfolk more accustomed to storekeeping than firefighting, to hold their own line along the river without the crew he'd sent to us instead. He dismounted long enough to accept a cup of water from our own well, hands still shaking slightly from exhaustion, and I watched something visibly ease in his face hearing his own report delivered aloud. The particular relief of a man who had gambled his own judgment against considerable risk and finally learned the gamble had paid for itself in more than just our own 2 ranches. "I'll not pretend I wasn't afraid the whole ride back," he admitted, wondering if I'd cost 40 families their town chasing a fairer arithmetic than the county commissioners would have chosen themselves. "Man in this job learns fast that being right and being popular are only occasionally the same thing." The fire burned itself out entirely by the following dawn, having consumed something near 11,000 acres of open range before a genuine rain finally arrived to finish what the firebreaks and backfires had already mostly accomplished. A slow, steady rain that felt after so many dry weeks, almost like a separate mercy layered on top of the first. I stood on our porch that next morning beside my father's chair watching a blackened, smoking, but fundamentally intact landscape stretched toward a horizon no longer carrying that particular threatening brown haze. The air itself washed clean by the overnight rain in a way that made the previous day's terror feel almost like something that had happened to different people entirely. My father took my hand that morning without saying much of anything, which from a man who had never been generous with words even before his stroke narrowed his usual expression of feeling even further, told me considerably more about his own relief and pride than any lengthy speech could have managed. I sat with him a long while in that particular exhausted quiet, both of us watching smoke still curling faintly off the blackened ground in the distance, and I understood, sitting there, that we had crossed some threshold together that morning neither of us would have chosen, but both of us, in our different ways, had proven equal to. That first night, once the immediate danger had passed and the backfire crew had ridden on toward whatever other trouble the county still needed them for, Wyatt stayed to share a late supper with my father and me rather than riding home to his own dark, empty house, and I remember the particular quality of that evening's quiet. 3 exhausted people too spent for much conversation, but none of us in any hurry to end the evening either. My father fell asleep in his chair before the meal was properly finished, worn out by a day that would have exhausted a man half his age in full health. And Wyatt and I sat on afterward in the low lamplight, close enough that our hands rested only inches apart on the table between us. I opened my mouth once to say something about the day, about him, about the particular strange gratitude twisting through me that had nothing to do with fences or grazing leases at all, and found the words considerably harder to locate than I'd expected. My own exhaustion tangling with a feeling too large and too new to fit easily into any sentence I could construct. He seemed to understand the difficulty without my needing to explain it, and simply covered my hand with his own, brief and warm, before rising to see himself out into the ash-scented dark, leaving whatever neither of us had quite managed to say, hanging unfinished. In the quiet kitchen behind him, Wyatt stayed on 2 more days helping repair the fence lines to the fire, and our own firebreak had damaged along our shared boundary. Work that required no particular urgency once the actual danger had passed, but that he showed up for anyway. Each morning, without my having asked a second time, it was mending that particular fence, working side by side in a silence that had stopped feeling chilly sometime during the previous day's crisis and started feeling instead like the comfortable quiet of 2 people who no longer needed constant conversation to be at ease together, that he finally said what I suspected he'd been considering saying since well before the fire ever started. Our fathers spent considerable money and considerable pride fighting over exactly where this fence ought to sit, he said, setting down a fresh post he'd just finished tamping into the ground, and I find myself mending it properly for the first time in a decade, wondering whether either of them ever once asked themselves if the fence was really the thing worth fighting over. I told him I'd wondered the same thing more than once, watching him work these past 2 days with a competence that made the old quarrel feel almost embarrassingly small by comparison. He set down his tools then and told me, plain and without any particular ceremony, that he'd ridden over that first morning telling himself it was simply the decent thing any neighbor owed another in a crisis, and that he'd spent every hour since discovering decency had considerably less to do with it than he'd initially let himself believe. I did not have a ready answer for that either, though I found myself standing in the ash-dusted afternoon light with a fence post between us instead of the old quarrel that used to stand there, considerably less inclined than usual to fill the silence with anything at all. My father died the following spring, peacefully in the same chair he'd watched the fire from, and I had sat with him most evenings that final winter as his strength continued its slow decline, the 2 of us talking through the ranch's daily business the way we always had, though we both understood by then that these conversations had become as much about companionship as any real necessity. Among the last clear things he said to me, in the particular plain language he'd always preferred over anything sentimental, was that he'd spent 30 years building a ranch he was proud to leave me, but that watching me stand my ground against that fire alongside a Callaway, of all people, had taught him something in his last year that 30 years of ranching alone never quite had, that the fences worth keeping were considerably fewer than the ones worth mending. I asked him, holding his hand in that same chair, whether he'd truly forgiven old man Callaway before either of them died, and he considered the question, a long moment before admitting that forgiveness had come easier once he'd watched 2 young people manage in a single afternoon what 2 grown men had spent a decade too proud to attempt. Daniel Callaway went on to serve as county fire warden a further 6 years, and folks still tell the story, when the subject of that particular fire comes up at gatherings, of the warden who sent his only crew to 2 struggling ranches instead of the township, and made himself answerable for that choice rather than hiding behind whatever arithmetic might have protected his own reputation more comfortably. The county commissioners, I heard later, had considered replacing him that same autumn over exactly that decision, before the full accounting of what the township's own volunteer brigades had accomplished without his crew reached their attention and quietly ended the discussion. Daniel never spoke of that close call himself, characteristically modest about a decision that had, by any fair measure, required more genuine courage than anything the rest of us had managed that day armed with plows and wet gunny sacks, and the simple advantage of fighting for ground we already loved. I think of that fire still some autumns, when the grass goes dry and brittle the way it does most years by September. And I think that the ground we plowed together that single, desperate day marked something considerably more permanent than any firebreak was ever meant to be. The fence between our 2 ranches still stands, where our fathers once fought over its placement, Neither of us has felt the need in all the years since to move it even an inch.